And as we get going, I want to first of all kind of explain our project and how I got involved in this. Back last summer, I was starting to put together a syllabus for a media history course that I would be teaching in the fall. And I was looking to develop a project, a real honest-to-goodness bit of history work, not simply a term paper that the student would write, I would see, and that would be the end of it. And at that very moment, serendipitously, Susan Ballinger of the library staff, where's Susan? Right here, got in touch with me, and she'd been given my name, and the question was, what did I know about the transmission of news in the South, and particularly Chapel Hill in North Carolina during the Civil War? And my answer was that it's not exactly in my research area. I've been doing a lot of work on the abolitionist press, but mostly in the North with Frederick Douglass in particular. But I said, I'm looking for a project for my class. How would it be if we were to conduct a project and essentially try to answer your question and enable you to use any of the material we developed for the exhibit? And everybody at Wilson Library Special Collections was very gracious, and what you see here is one result of this project that we came up with. What we're doing essentially is looking to develop a history of the print culture of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 1861, 1865. We didn't look specifically at the university because we knew that was going to be done in the overall exhibit. But we were looking to see just what was going on in news work during this period, and in particular, perhaps take a look at how it might compare and contrast with the journalism that was going on in the North. So we divided the class into 4 teams. One team essentially looked at just what was going on in Chapel Hill and Orange County during this period. A second team looked at the business of news and the transmission of news and what some of the problems were there. A third team looked at a specific battle. This was, again, a suggestion by Susan that really paid dividends, was to look and see how a battle was covered. And if possible, take a look at current scholarship and see whether or not the newspapers got it right in their original coverage. So the team that was looking at news of battle chose the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862, and it proved a really good battle to be examining for this purpose. Our fourth team looked at essentially what else was on the agenda of the newspapers at the time. And there was a lot going on, some of which we kind of knew going in, and others which were quite surprising in the way of some of the things that we saw. So what I'd like to do essentially is kind of walk us back from the position of you're a reader in Chapel Hill, what are you reading in 1861 through the war years, and having done that, then to go to the next step and say, okay, where are the newspapers that are on your reading agenda, where are they getting their news, how are they getting their news, and so on. And then look at a bit on about the content of what was there, and just also look at the legacy, because journalism changed tremendously during the Civil War. A lot of the forms that we now kind of take for granted in newspaper work really can be traced to the war and the exigencies that created solutions that sometimes the journalists and their editors were making pretty much on the fly. Let me start. For those of you in my age cohort, welcome to Antiques Roadshow. For those of you of another cohort, welcome to Hogwarts. But in any event, let's take a look at what was available to the reader. Now, Chapel Hill at the beginning of the war and throughout the war would not have its own newspaper. The Chapel Hill newspaper would come only after the war, but we did have in Orange County the Hillsborough Recorder. The Recorder was one of the oldest newspapers in North Carolina. It and its editor, Dennis Hart, was one of the most respected of the editors. He was considered essentially the dean of the Carolina editors. Also available, though, to our resident in Chapel Hill would have been a number of other publications produced in Raleigh over the period. And these are only a handful of them, but the Southern Fireside, the semi-weekly Raleigh Register, the Christian Advocate, and the Semi-Weekly Standard. And what we can say is that, by and large, the reader in Chapel Hill was not receiving a daily newspaper produced in North Carolina. They were typically weeklies or semi-weeklies, and as I say, a number of them came from Raleigh. We see also by the names that not all of them were really necessarily news-oriented as we would think of it today. The Christian Advocate, for instance, and there were other religious publications that were being produced. In 1861, Raleigh had, we know of at least, 6 newspapers being published. Interestingly enough, that number would grow to 13 by the war's end. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Readers probably were also, at the beginning of the war at least, before communications became problematic, we're probably getting a number of other newspapers and magazines sent by the mail. And the mail was the principal distribution of newspapers at this time. A study of the post office records of Rocky Mount, North Carolina for 1860 discloses that people were getting on average 2, 3, 4 publications weekly or monthly through the mails, and the post office was keeping track of these things, and because they were charging for the mails, and as a result, we know that there was a considerable degree of interest in publications, and certainly as we come to Chapel Hill and the university community, we can reasonably infer that there were a lot of people receiving more than one publication at this time. Now, stepping back now to where did the news come from? Where did the publication, where do the newspapers get their news? It's a combination of technology and more mundane things to look at. First of all, an important tool in much of this coverage was the telegraph. The telegraph was relatively new. It was really started into its own only for news work in about the beginning of 1850, the late 1840s, early 1850s. So by 1861, it was certainly a presence. It was an important tool, but it had its limitations. First of all, wires strung on poles through woods and what have you had a way of breaking, and so the connections could be lost simply by natural causes. With the onset of war, you get unnatural causes, people shooting the wires down, people chopping down the telegraph poles and what have you. So the telegraph was there. It was being used not only for news purposes, of course, but more importantly by the military and the government to transmit orders and reports back and forth. So the telegraph was a factor. It was a little problematic for journalists in that they had a lower priority. Certainly to a field commander wanting to send a message to headquarters or what have you. So out of that, we'll talk about a little bit more in terms of the legacy of the war. We get one of the most commonly taught, commonly used organizational forms in newspaper writing, and that is the inverted pyramid. I'll come back to that. But telegraph was certainly one way to do it. Also, and Susan was asking me earlier about the question of a story or a news story says that they received something by a dispatch from a correspondent in the field. That's one of the two things going on there that are important. First of all is the question of what is a dispatch and how is it handled. Sometimes the dispatch meant that it was sent by telegraph, but they could also send a dispatch by some sort of courier or what have you. The journalists also would use the mails. And depending on the organization, the newspaper, the reporter or correspondent in the field might have a lot of resources to work with, relatively speaking, or not very many at all. And Dean Smith did some research in the Southern collection several years ago and came upon a complaint by a correspondent for the New York Times, which in 1860, 61, 62 was only about 10 years old, and it was not the preeminent paper that it would become. Much more important and larger circulations were in the New York Herald and the New York Tribune. So this correspondent that Dean came across is complaining to his headquarters that essentially the guys at the Herald have all the money and they have the access to horses and can get the news around, and he has to, this poor Times correspondent's got to send his stuff by mail. So mail was important, mail was getting through, and that was another way that news was being transmitted. Another way that the journalists got their news was essentially by the interview. And the interview was not a well-developed form by this period of time. This is, again, something that kind of emerges from the Civil War. Newspapering before the Civil War often was a matter of the editor sitting down and writing a strongly held opinion, or republishing letters that he had received from correspondents who likewise were expressing more of their own opinions rather than giving you a kind of dispassionate, objective report on some issue. The correspondents and editors were starting to be aware that they needed to talk to people, find out what was going on. And one of the things that you find in the news columns, particularly I've seen it a lot in the Raleigh press of the period, is a reference to people arriving last night by the cars. In other words, they were coming in by railroad, coming in from, in one case, they brought in reports of what was going on in Ambrose Burnside's campaigns on the east coast of North Carolina, on the Outer Banks. So people moving around became sources of news as well. And finally, a very common system that had been in place since colonial times, the very first newspapers, and would continue with some amendments through even to today, was what we call the exchange press. And the exchange press simply was that an editor was encouraged by the government, because through reduced postal rates, a subsidy essentially from the government, to send newspapers to other editors. And these editors would then clip stories that they were interested in republishing. And so you have a story that appears in one location 1 week, and a week later it's showing up someplace else. And so this was a very important means of transmitting news. And also it was just as today, where we have wire services that send you a single version of a story, so too a single version of a story could get quite a bit of mileage in 1861. So those are some of the things that we need to take a look at, and we will see in looking at newspapers of this period. We'll see a mix. There was a high degree of interest in technology, and the Telegraph really becomes an important tool. But so too is just word of mouth, and of course what other papers were saying about something. Media dependency is kind of an arcane term, but what it means essentially is that newspapers were vitally important to people of this period, because there really was no other substitute. And it was also a time that really, when you look at the 1840s, 1850s, you see essentially what has been called a golden age of literacy in America. Now, this did not, of course, extend to African Americans in the South, but much of the population of the United States, the white population, had the advantage of education that had not been available in the 1830s and earlier than that. And they put a very high premium on newspapers, hence the number of newspapers that somebody might be subscribing to. In the Civil War, we have momentous things going on that affect everybody. And the only way well, maybe not the only way, but one of the principal ways that people could find things out about what was going on the battlefield and in the seats of power in government, the Confederate capital in Richmond, as a case in point. The only way you could get that information was coming through the newspapers to any large extent, to a large population. Letters, yes, they were another source, but the mails were also, while the postal system existed and served people pretty well, it also was not without its problems. Much as today, sometimes we don't get a letter when we're expecting it in the mail. So the newspaper is terrifically important here. And one of the things that this case, and I'm just going to kind of highlight some things, you can take a look at them later on, but the case kind of indicates this avid interest in newspapers. One of my favorite pictures is General Burnside sitting on a stump in camp reading a newspaper. This is the commanding general of Union forces. He's been very successful in Eastern Carolina, and now he is in Virginia at Fredericksburg, where he would lead his forces into a real debacle for the Union Army. But he's taken time out and he's reading a newspaper. Newspapers were important to field commanders because they could tell you something about what the other side was doing. And so while it was not an open door, there is a traffic of newspapers north and south going across the battle lines. And our students in the project came upon references to how highly the Southern commanders valued the northern papers, particularly out of Philadelphia and New York, because they tended to be more accurate, they felt, than some of the Southern papers that they were reading. So the commanders wanted that news. So did the troops. And one of the things that we came across was actually Holly Smith. Is Holly here today? Holly, one of the Wilson Special Collection staff, called my attention to a subscription that was taken up by the Baptist Church in Chapel Hill to send a Baptist newspaper to the troops. And we have some colleagues of mine, Betty Winfield, who was a visiting professor here in the journalism school last fall, did a study of media dependency and found that the troops were very, very eager to get any news they could from the home front. This is their way to find out what was going on at home, how the folks were, what were their concerns, and what have you. So down to the troop level, this was terrifically important. On the home front, the newspapers, certainly the reports of battle were eagerly seized on. And what we find, among other types of content dealing with the war, besides descriptions of battles, which you'll see, for instance, in a fairly extensive coverage of Fredericksburg in the New York Herald, we find also in the local press extensive casualty lists, right down to the company level, and every private who was shot, every captain who was killed is listed at some point in the newspapers. And there are a couple of things. First of all, Cornelia Phillips Spencer, who has left us remarkable records of what life was like in Chapel Hill during this period, talks about the concern people have as they go to these casualty lists and who will they find on them. And there's another wife of a faculty member who similarly writes to her sister and says, with what dread we open the paper and look to the Telegraph to see who has fallen and who has been wounded. So these were very, very important types of content for these people coming out of the battlefield. One of the things that we see also in content is a fair amount of kind of day-to-day stuff, and it's a little surprising sometimes. you're reading a paper that is being published in and around the Battle of Fredericksburg or Gettysburg and what have you, and you're getting these battlefield accounts and what have you, and yet on page 1 there is a story about how to grow better crops. And here's what you need to do for a field of corn. And so it's a mix of content here that is very revealing about life and needs during this period of time. We also got into a little bit, and there's a interesting piece of research work by one of my students in this project. She found, and I'll leave it to you as a little puzzle if you get a chance to look at this later. See if you can find the line where it says in one sentence that 2 British ships have arrived in Wilmington with goods from the continent. And the interesting thing, and Jessica put 2 and 2 together because she read in the Hillsborough Recorder 2 weeks later an ad for British goods. So we can tell pretty much that these goods were coming in. The ships had broken the blockade of Wilmington, and goods put on the Wilmington to Weldon Railroad, which ran north or south to north into Virginia, would stop at the siding at Hillsborough, where the North Carolina Railroad came in, and those goods would be offloaded and could be in Hillsborough for sale within a couple of weeks. So it's kind of interesting, a bit of detective work there. The same student, Jessica Hayes, also came up with, in looking at advertising, found the kinds of things that were being offered or sought. There was a textile mill in Hillsborough that ran an ad for many weeks. It was a standing ad, and the headline was "Wool!" exclamation point, "Wool!" exclamation point, "Wool!" exclamation point, and it offered to essentially trade finished textile good work for raw wool, which was needed for the military, in particular military uniforms. And what she found in the process is, looking at this ad 6 or 7 weeks running, so all of a sudden at about week 4, it becomes wool, wool, fool. And for 2 weeks it's wool, wool, fool, and then they found it out, somebody found this out and corrected it, and it became wool, wool, wool again. And what we think is going on there is that even in wartime, we have this apprentice, probably in the Hillsborough Recorder, playing a trick. And we know that that happened because Mark Twain, among others, writes about doing the same kind of thing when he was an apprentice in his brother's print shop, newspaper office. So the youthful tricks sometimes got in the way, but the idea here of the commodities that they were seeking comes out very clear in what they were advertising for. Also in the way of news content is exhortation. There is a growing concern throughout the South and in North Carolina that they're not getting enough recruits, and there are successive conscription acts that essentially draft young men, and elsewhere in this exhibit you will find discussion of how that affected the university. But they weren't getting enough recruits, they felt, and so you see various commanders up to and including Robert E. Lee circularizing this need for enlistment, and at a later point they start sending the same kinds of letters out, but this time the discussion is desertion. North Carolina is said to have contributed the most men. It also had the highest desertion rates during the Civil War. I'll leave it to other scholars to pin that down, but I have read that in a couple of places. But in any event, there's a lot of government communication that's being published in these, along with the mundane, the everyday. And this was not a healthy environment for anywhere in the country, and we're always seeing in the papers of this period discussions of outbreaks of smallpox, typhoid fever, and what have you. And so along with all of the other content in the Hillsborough Recorder, we see about the deaths of children to typhus and those kinds of things. And it's really kind of you have the very large picture issues of war and governance, and then you have in the same content these rather poignant and very brief but very poignant mentions of children 4 years old, 3 years old, and whatnot succumbing. One of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit is essentially what it is that the war kind of contributed to journalism and essentially the legacy of journalism. I mentioned one of them already, and that was how we organize a story. The inverted pyramid. The inverted pyramid, for those of you who are not in Professor Calvin's class, the inverted pyramid is a shape, if you will, applied to the way to organize a news story that came out of the Civil War. And you have a summary statement of the news at the very top, and followed in kind of descending order of importance are supporting facts and figures. And the idea here is that the inverted pyramid could be stopped, it could be cut off at any point for a number of reasons. One, if it was a Telegraph story, and this is generally associated as a form that was really important to telegraph transmission. If the telegraph line broke, but you at least got a paragraph or two, somebody had some news. If you're in the process of trying to send a story and a commander comes along and says, I need the wires, you still had a story get across. So the form was very useful, and it remained useful in journalism. It has its critics today, but it's still a workhorse form that we use in news writing and reporting. So that was one of the legacies. It's argued that it has long been held that the reporters themselves came up with the inverted pyramid form. Since then, a scholar whom I don't know I entirely agree with, but has argued that the form actually originated in the War Department in Washington. But in any event, it does come out of the Civil War period. So that's one of the issues that we can look at as kind of a legacy. Another is, and this triptych here, which appeared in Harper's, offers a couple points to be made about that. It shows reporters in the field. And as I said earlier, interviewing was not a highly developed art prior to the Civil War, but during the Civil War, it really started to come into its own. And as reporters here in this, and this is a cartoon by Thomas Nast, by the way, it shows reporters in several different venues, essentially notebook in hand, taking down information. An interesting development. Another thing that is important to the legacy of the war is that as the illustration shows, we come out of the war with a much greater sense of the potential for illustration in newswork. And you look at these papers from that period, from the South in Raleigh, and you don't see too much illustration. What you find is maybe a standing woodcut. You might find in advertising a picture of a locomotive or a steamboat or what have you, and that'll be used over and over and over and over again, and in possibly multiple ads. But in any event, you don't have news illustration. But the illustrated weeklies, Harper's and Leslie's, are very, very popular in this time, and we don't have a representation of it, but they were Southern versions of the same thing. And one of the things you find is that in media of this period, there's sort of parallel universes. You have what the North is doing and what the South is doing, and they're doing about the same thing, but with some constraints in the South that the North did not suffer, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the illustrated weeklies, magazines, really bring the idea of the visual representation into its own. And Harper's in particular would have these incredibly passionate, very polemical battlefield sketches being drawn by some of the top artists in the country at the time. Winslow Homer is a battlefield artist during the Civil War. Thomas Nast is perhaps most famously known for his cartoons involving the Tweed Ring in Tammany Hall in New York City in the later 19th century, is on the field as well. So they invested quite a bit, and the result was widely popular. Now, newspapers were, particularly dailies, did not have the technology to do that on a regular basis during the Civil War, but they certainly would catch on, and this became a real quest. And so by the 1870s, you're starting to see a lot of illustration that wasn't there a decade earlier. Another thing about, in terms of graphics, the Brady photo of General Burnside is emblematic, if you will, of the interest in this new technology, photography. It's not been applied much out of the studio up to this point. But with the beginning of the war, Brady sends his teams down into the battlefield areas, and they produce a very interesting record of photographic record, and it's the first real battlefield photography that we have. The problem with photography at that time is that it did not lend itself to action, and so everybody is pretty static and posed and what have you, and told not to move for long periods of time. But it nevertheless gets its start, and it would again not be too much after the Civil War before technology in the newspaper offices had enabled itself to be able to produce these images on a regular basis. One of the things that I mentioned, the parallel universes, and the problem that sometimes we have to take into account is that the South did not have, even going into the war, the resources that the Northern papers had. And partly this is sort of a theory of mine, and it bears further examination, but partly I think the Northern papers had started to turn to a professional model, a business model of journalism, while the Southern papers are still guided very strongly by political feeling and partisanship. And as a result, the newspapers in the North, because they had larger readerships, because of the concentration of potential readers in urban areas and industrial areas, had resources. They had the money to do things that the Southern papers did not. So we have, it's not in this collection, but there are pictures, for instance, of the wagon, the camp essentially, of the correspondents for the New York Herald. And there are a bunch of them. And as opposed to the lone correspondent maybe coming from a group of newspapers in the South. There is in the North, and has been for a while, the Associated Press. Well, with the coming of the war, the lines are drawn essentially, and they are cut. The Telegraph, for instance, 2 days or so after the fall of Fort Sumter, the Army in Washington moves in and cuts the telegraph line to the South. The South has its own telegraph system. It's the other half, the second half, if you will, of what had been a national system. And they would work with that and use it pretty effectively, but it was still not the whole 9 yards that had existed before. And so we're dealing with numbers of correspondents in the field. We're dealing with access through technology that is disparate. And one of the things that you see here, and admittedly this is kind of an apples and oranges comparison, but it holds up if you think about it in a certain way. When you get a chance to look at this case, if you haven't already, one of the things that we found is a fairly extensive use in the New York and Philadelphia papers, Baltimore, of woodcut maps, battlefield plans, and here's where the troops were and what have you. This is very common in these papers, and you don't see anything like that in these Southern papers. It takes resources, it takes money, it takes a differentiation of labor to be able to do this kind of work on an overnight basis, and these papers don't really have that capacity. And as I say, this is a large metropolitan paper. These are not, so the comparison is a little bit iffy on that point. But another thing that we can say is that in the South, because of a number of factors, the business of putting out a newspaper is getting tougher and tougher as the war goes on. There are paradoxes, and one of them that strikes me in particular is that you have, as interest in news is surging, people want the news, they want to know what's going on, they need these newspapers to find things out, and yet the papers are undergoing all sorts of privations that are getting in the way of doing just that. Cornelius Phillip Spencer talks about how keen the interest was in newspapers, particularly, and she mentions this, newspapers that came from the United Kingdom or those that actually found their way down from the north, were being passed around till they were worn out. People read them, passed them on to somebody else, read them, passed them on, and they were worn out. She also notes, and so do the editors in these papers on a regular basis, some of the other problems they're running into. First of all is cash. There isn't enough money circulating in the Confederacy, and inflation is getting worse and worse, and so the newspaper editors are really constrained in what they can do because they just don't have money. Their income streams were twofold. One was advertising, of course, but advertising was not that well developed by this time as a revenue stream, and so subscriptions, circulation revenue was hugely important. But the problem was that the inflation was so fast in unfolding that whereas they once would have sold a subscription on an annual basis, so much $3 for a year's worth of papers, they knew that the money was so worthless and becoming so worthless that they would only sell on a 6-month subscription, and even then they were probably losing money. They also, and this is something that was true in the North as well, once you have put somebody on your subscription list, it's very, very tough to take that person off, even if he or she hasn't paid for that subscription for quite a while. So they were reluctant to cut off bad subscribers, and often did not, so they continued to distribute the newspaper with no return on it whatsoever. And of course, pass along, even on the local press, was such that many more people were likely to benefit from the newspaper than were to pay for it in the process. And all along, and again, this is true in papers north and south, one of the stock genre stories is pay your bills. They're continually coming up with rather, sometimes very clever ways of doing this, but they're basically begging their readers to pay up, and you enjoy the service. Now, time to make good on it. So there's a cash shortage. Another thing is that there's a paper shortage, and this gets huge. And again, Cornelius Spencer says that by war's end, not only in North Carolina, but throughout the Confederacy, pages that had once been full broadsheets with on nice white stock were shrunk. The editors are repeatedly telling us, we're sorry, this week the paper is going to a new size because we don't have enough paper and we can't get it. And it's a poor quality paper. Why is that? Well, in part it's answered by the fact that paper and newsprint in those days used a lot of rag. And one of the reasons why a paper, now this has been well protected, but this is an original 1862 edition of the New York Herald, and it looks pretty bright and pristine. If you put the News and Observer out in your driveway for about 6 hours, it's going to turn yellow and brittle and what have you. Well, paper has changed, and one of the technologies that we no longer have is the high rag content that went into these papers. Where are the rags going? Well, some of them are going into bandages for the battlefields. Some of them are also going into munitions. So the reallocation of resources puts a real dent on newspapering at this time. And so as a result, these papers are coming out in smaller and smaller versions. One editor in Raleigh in informing his readers that the paper was going to be smaller from here on in, said, but the, sort of a bad side, good side. The good side was that his advertising had also fallen so badly that the amount of news content was probably going to be about the same, even in the new, smaller version. So these are the kinds of things that they were dealing with in the South in particular. In the South, too, we see a lot of drain on manpower. Printers are being conscripted or volunteering to go into the service. And so print shops are advertising for 2 journeyman printers for 6 months work guaranteed, trying to essentially find people who can keep these newspapers going. Now, as I said, there are a lot of paradoxes here, though. We said that as news interest is surging, newspapers are really scrambling to be able to survive. But another paradox is, I mentioned that at the beginning of the war there were 6 newspapers published in Raleigh that we know about. By 1865 there were 13. And Cornelius Spencer tells us that whereas in 1861 there were 2 dailies published in North Carolina, throughout North Carolina, in 1865, she says, there are 4 dailies in Raleigh alone. So the impulse for newspapering, the need for newspapering, keeps the industry alive, even though it has gone through all of these privations. Some of those papers, of course, were very short-lived for various reasons. First of all, when your nameplate is the Confederate, you have a very short lifespan when General Sherman arrives in Raleigh to take over. So the Confederate and some of the other pro-government papers were shut down by the arrival of federal troops in Raleigh. Others of the papers were essentially political sheets. The Conservative, for instance, in Raleigh lasted a year, but it was basically intended to promote the candidacy of Zebulon Vance for governor. And so once he becomes elected governor, he no longer needs the newspaper and it goes away. So there's an ebb and flow there that will continue throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. But these are some of the factors that go into that question of what do you, as the reader in Chapel Hill in 1861 or 1862 or 1865, what are you getting and what are you seeing and how are you using it? So I'd love to, I'll stop there and take questions if that's it. Okay, well, let's go for questions. This is strangely like one of my classes. Yes?
You mentioned the shortage of manpower in printing shops. Did they ever use women in any of these instances?
They may have, but that record has not come through. I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case because that had been the case going back into colonial times. Wives would work alongside their husbands in these print shops. Widows would take over a newspaper and run them, and we have a number of instances like that. Now, one of the things, though, that does enter this, I mentioned the sort of professionalization of the press through the 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, and that is that there is a greater division of labor. Production departments are now production departments and the newsroom is someplace else and so on. And so in that process, you no longer have the ability of one person, male or female, to kind of run his or her own shop. And it's no longer quite that simple. So it's an interesting question and one that I think would make good research fodder. Yeah. It was primarily a masculine role. Now, it's not to say there were not female writers here and there. And Cornelius Phillip Spencer will become a writer of for newspapers. He even runs her own edits her own newspaper briefly. But that comes after the Civil War. She arrived in Chapel Hill, re-arrived essentially. Her father was on the faculty here. She had lived in further south and her husband died in 1861. She came to Chapel Hill in 1861, and if you read her own accounts in a very interesting book called The Last 90 Days of the Civil War, which she wrote in installments for a newspaper in New York City in 1866, and it was, they were then collected in a book that was issued. As she describes her life in the early days of Chapel Hill, 1861, 62, she was, I think by all reasonable measures, a very, very shattered woman. And she was essentially in what I would say looks like chronic depression, or clinical depression rather. And she doesn't start to come out of that until 1864 or so. So she was not a journalist at that time, but she became a really good chronicler of things. And I think that what you see in terms of women in these roles was more in that hometown. They would write letters to their newspapers. Women were very active. Again, the war has depleted the supply of manpower, and so you have, again, in terms of content, letters being published in the Hillsborough Recorder from the troops thanking the women for sending them socks, or pleading with them to send them socks or other goods that they need because the conditions are so bad. Troop trains moved through on the North Carolina Railroad, stopping in Hillsborough, and women in the area would meet the trains and give them, baked goods or knitted goods or hand goods or whatever to support the war effort. So they were very important in a number of ways. And I will bet that somewhere there is a female correspondent who's just waiting to be discovered in that mix, but we don't really seem to have one there yet. Yeah.
I know that the State Library digitized the Salisbury newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And given all this activity, I'm more puzzled than I was. I'm puzzled why they didn't do more, or why Salisbury? Why did they?
Why would they just do Salisbury in terms of digitalizing? Boy, I defer to.
Good question. Next. That's a very good question. Newspaper digitization is a very expensive process, so I don't have a good answer for you on that one. But there have been different titles here and there, and that is a topic of conversation that continually comes up and is continually being discussed. But that's my very vague answer that really doesn't address it at all.
I think we probably had Salisbury was a more prominent place in the 19th century than it is now.
Yeah, I mean,
And you also have the Confederate prison there. You have other things going on.
And I wondered if it was continuous. I know it didn't fail to get burned.
The arsenal was burned out.
And I think the paper was closed in.
well, yeah, I mean, if you were on the wrong side of whoever was in power, you could have a rough time of it. One of the, I didn't mention here, and not to, I'll come back to your question because I have a thought too on that, other than that you've got to start somewhere. But one of the figures that's really important in North Carolina journalism is back in the news today, and that's William Woods Holden. And he's represented over here in one of the other cases, but Holden was the editor of the North Carolina Standard, a weekly and semi-weekly newspaper in Raleigh that was a very, very important newspaper. And Holden was clearly the most controversial editor in North Carolina during the period, and probably the most controversial in the whole of the South, in that he started out in the 1850s. He got control of the North Carolina Standard and made it a leading Democratic newspaper. But he was, like several of the editors, a very complex figure. And we found, the students and I were both surprised, or all surprised, at finding that at the beginning of, or just at the brink of war and secession, some of the leading editors of North Carolina were very much pro-union. They were not abolitionists. They were pro-slavery. They were anti-Lincoln, but pro-union. They saw this as a ruinous idea that could just not lead anywhere good. And so Dennis Hart and the Hillsborough Recorder, who actually had trained Holden. Holden was an apprentice in Hart's shop early on. But Dennis Hart, William Holden, the editor of the Fayetteville Observer, all have been campaigning editorially against disunion, against secession. And they hold this line right up to the point where not when Fort Sumter falls, but when Lincoln calls out the federal troops to send them into the South. And all of a sudden, North Carolina is saying this is it, because even the idea of secession elsewhere, not just the editors, they either influenced or reflected, and you can kind of argue which way that goes, but there was a strong constituency in North Carolina, particularly in this area, against secession. So it was by no means a done deal until Lincoln calls out the troops. And at that point, North Carolina, Virginia, and the northern states of the Confederacy join the lower South and secede. Now, Holden, though, will change his opinion. And one could be argued that Holden is a bit, we were talking about this yesterday on the talk show, The State of Things. Holden is driven by no little amount of opportunism at times, or at least it seems. And by 1863, Holden is now a leading figure in the peace movement. And he's arguing in his newspaper for North Carolina to secede from the Confederacy, which brings out then a comment from another editor saying this is really a wacky idea. You're going to have two enemies now to fight, not just the North. You're going to also be at war with the South. Needless to say, the secession idea doesn't go very far. But Holden is known throughout the Confederate armies. And in August of 1863, a unit of the North Carolina infantry has a meeting in the field. And the officers and the men, a very egalitarian affair, draft this series of resolutions condemning Holden, condemning any wishy-washiness, anything that might harm the Southern cause, and they send these resolutions to all of the friendly editors in North Carolina condemning Holden. A month later, a brigade of Georgia troops being transferred through Raleigh goes and finds, actually talks to Holden and says, "Where's your newspaper office?" And for whatever reason, he tells them, and they go down and ransack it. And his type is all thrown out in the streets. They didn't destroy his presses, but his type is all just completely scattered, and he's out of business for a month. So Holden was a very much reviled figure in the Confederacy in terms of the troops and the Confederate government, because he was a strong critic of the Confederate government. Now, as you know from the current readings in the News and Observer, Holden just yesterday was pardoned, or he wasn't pardoned, but a vote was taken in the Senate to pardon Holden, who was the first sitting governor impeached and removed from office after the war, because he had become governor under the Reconstruction movement. By this time now, he'd moved from being a staunch Democrat, and before that he'd been a staunch Whig, by the way, but he became a staunch Democrat, and then with the new order of things becomes a staunch Republican. And so as long as the federal troops are in town and the Republicans are in control, he's safe. And as you probably have noted, he called out the militia to quell a Ku Klux Klan activity in the Piedmont, and as a result was impeached by the Democrats, who had by now gotten back into power. So these individual stories are interesting in terms of what is going on. And it may lead to then an interest in, to get back to that question, it may lead to an interest to, in fact, digitalize or do something special with one paper in particular over another. As I say, you do have to start somewhere, but sometimes it's driven by availability. Sometimes it's driven by, is it an interesting paper? And so on. So, but again, this is out of my area. I don't get into that kind of archival work, so I benefit from the work that's being done there as we have, but I don't begin to understand exactly how it all works. Yeah.
My great-grandfather was in the Pennsylvania unit up in Bermuda 100 on picket duty, and interestingly enough, they not only traded coffee for tobacco, but they were exchanging newspapers.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
The newspapers he was reading, and what I was able to see in his letters, was the Morning Star, an abolitionist paper. It came out of the Free Will Baptist movement, a lot of New Hampshire, and then the New York Tribune.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what he was trading, which of course makes me wonder what the reception would be on the other side. Nevertheless, it was interesting not only that they would find reason to exchange newspapers, but it's curious to know what those newspapers were. Of course, there had to be a great deal of trust even to go out of your picket and exchange this.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah, this is a very interesting phenomenon. You have these moments of truce between, just between us privates. We're going to get together in the middle of this stream and we're going to exchange coffee and for a newspaper or what have you. And newspapers were that valued that they ranked right up there with coffee and tobacco as something that the troops needed and wanted, and would go to considerable lengths and at some risk to obtain. And again, I've not really ever seen that question pursued, and I think it's a great one, and that is, just how did they use the bartered newspaper, essentially? Perhaps it's...
it was like a one-liner because he was writing it that night to his wife.
Yeah.
That's as much as we know. We can make all kinds of interesting inferences.
Well, that's one of the fun things that I got involved in kind of working with the students, and this was very much of a collegial approach to this. I wanted them to feel that they were my colleagues and I was their colleague, and we kind of learned things together and shared discoveries as we went, and some of them were really fun, but they were sometimes these one-liners that you find in a letter, and it's just sort of there and you don't know quite what to make of it, and if you're lucky, a few more letters down the road you're going to find some more references to those things, but sometimes they are mysteries. Where are those letters, by the way?
Actually, I have.
I think we probably found the end of our hour.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Dr. Fee for
Thank you.